Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another Instant Deck Tech. Today we're going to be looking at a pretty sweet mono-green aggro list for Standard. Recently took Dan Ward to first place at a SCG Standard IQ in the Catskills, so congrats to Dan Ward on his finish with this deck. Before we break down this mono-green aggro list, quick reminder, if you like this deck, you want to see it made into videos, take a minute, click the like button, the subscribe button, leave a comment, anything you can do to support your deck, because whichever deck is most popular will get made into videos the following week. Anyway, let's talk about mono-green aggro. So the first thing I thought when I saw this deck was, oh, this is a Hardened Scales deck. Then I thought for a minute longer and realized that Hardened Scales is no longer in Standard. Normally, when the namesake card in a deck rotates, the deck ceases to exist. But apparently, Hardened Scales decks can survive without Hardened Scales in the form of mono-green aggro. So this deck, every single creature in the deck gets +1/+1 counters. So Endless One enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters. Servant of the Scale enters with a +1/+1 counter, and you can move it to something else when it dies. Rot Shambler gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature you control dies. And Mana Gorger Hydra gets a +1/+1 counter whenever anyone casts a spell. So these creatures are obviously better with Hardened Scales, but some of them are still pretty powerful on their own. Endless One, Mana Gorger Hydra. Not so sure about Servant of the Scale, but we can give it a pass. Then the deck has a Planeswalker, Nissa Voice of Zendikar, which, you guessed it, puts +1/+1 counters on everything. So many +1/+1 counter synergies. It can also make plant tokens to put the +1/+1 counters on. And it synergizes really well with Hangerback Walker, which is a really powerful creature that likes to have +1/+1 counters on it, because when it dies, you get a Thopter for each +1/+1 counter that it has. So that is the +1/+1 counter package. As you can see, everything has to do with +1/+1 counters. So the question I'm sure you're asking right now is, why bother to play so many +1/+1 counter cards without Hardened Scales? Well, there still are a couple good payoff cards. First off is Inspiring Call. Inspiring Call is really nuts if you have a lot of creatures with +1/+1 counters. It's a 3-mana instant. It draws you a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter, and it makes them indestructible. So not only can it save your team, but it can draw you 3, 4, 5 cards if you have a board full of creatures with +1/+1 counters. And since every creature in the deck has +1/+1 counters, it's drawing you a card for each creature you control. Avatar the Resolute gets a +1/+1 counter for each other creature you control with a +1/+1 counter. If you have 3 creatures, Avatar the Resolute's going to be a 6/5 for only 2 mana, which is pretty absurd and pretty powerful for its mana cost. As for the rest of the deck, Warping Whale and Spatial Contortion, since we're a mono-green deck, we don't have access to good removal, so we gotta play the colorless removal. It's still fine, and it still gives the deck access to removal spells and the ability to kill something. Then, mana base wise, you just notice the colorless removal spell. Well, we need some colorless lands. So we have Rogue's Passage, can make a huge Avatar the Resolute, Mana Gorger Hydra, Rot Shambler unblockable until the end of turn. Foundry of the Consoles can rebuild after removal, sack it to make some more Thopter tokens. Westville Abbey can flip around into a huge threat, maybe by sacking the Foundry of the Console tokens or the plant tokens made by Nissa. And then a bunch of forests so we can cast our green spells. In the sideboard, we're running into a control deck package. Evolutionary Leap is great at blanking your removal spells. You just sack the creature in response, get another creature. Really easy to out-attrition a control deck with Evolutionary Leap on the battlefield. Mana Reshaper, same thing. When it dies, you draw a card or put it right on the battlefield if it's cheap. And Vile Redeemer can rebuild your board after a Wrath by giving you a bunch of Scion tokens. Then there's a bunch of removal, Natural State for artifacts and enchantments, Plummet for flyers, more Warping Whales, another Spatial Contortion, and then the last Inspiring Call. Anyway, that has been our Instant Deck Tech for mono-green aggro and Standard, essentially scaleless Hardened Scales. Thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon.